Thank you, Mr. President, members of the legislature. Thank you for this debate, too. This is a very important issue, I think. Senator Shimmick said something that I glommed onto and that I wrote down. The state of Nebraska hires gay and lesbian people, no questions asked. If that's the case, doesn't that disprove the need for this bill? I don't see this. Maybe I don't get out much. I have kids. Maybe I'm not out to see the rampant discrimination against people because of sexual orientation within the workplace. I'm curious, is there a great need for this bill? Part of that list of protected classes, part of their history was that there was great discrimination. There has been great discrimination based on race or religion. The need existed, and so a just society addressed that need. Now, my point by saying that this has become listed in the negative, rather than this bill being a positive, it's now listed as a non-discrimination in the negative, is that it would then become more consistent for us to list all of those individuals or classes which we ought to extend protected class status to. We have to start listing them all off. Sexual orientation, I don't see the grand discrimination across the country based on sexual orientation in the workplace. I did some quick research, and my legislative aide found some research. I inquired what is the average salary per capita of homosexual couples as compared to heterosexual couples. And I found, this is a little bit old, but I think it still illustrates my point here. It was reported in the Wall Street Journal, July 18th, 1991. Average annual household income. Blacks with 3 years of high school, $12,166 a year, average household income. Hispanics with 1 to 3 years of high school, $17,939, about $18,000 a year. The national average annual household income, $32,000 a year. For those declaring a homosexual orientation, average annual household income, $55,430. They make more than we do here in the legislature, that household anyway. Probably reasons for that. 2 individuals, each with separate careers, often not having a lot of kids, if they have kids at all. Average annual household income, about 80% higher than the national average. If that's the case, and there is rampant discrimination within the employment, within the workplace, how is it that they have this high a household average, those who declare a homosexual orientation? So again, I'm asking, what necessitates this bill? Are we responding to widespread discrimination? Have you ever been lobbied by a Filipino group? Do the Filipino groups have lobbyists out there? Maybe they're avoiding me. I don't know. I haven't been lobbied by a Filipino group. My mom, I suppose that counts, but...
1 minute.
Did you get lobbied to support this bill? I did. Actually had a very good discussion. I like debate. Does the need exist to take a great and remarkable step in our public policy to extend protected class status to one based on sexual orientation? I say no. The data that I have before me indicate no. I'd like to put that question out there. I also am curious, what is the definition of sexual orientation? Perhaps the NAMBLA example is too far-fetched, but I don't know. There is no definition for sexual orientation. How far do we take it? A couple of questions that I put forward to the body. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Fulton. Senator Carlson, you're next. You are recognized.
Mr. President, members of the legislature. I would address a question to Senator Ashford, if he would yield.
Senator Ashford, would you yield?
I will, Mr. President. I was trying to save my code again. Thanks.
Okay, Senator Ashford, I asked on the statement of intent. In the third paragraph, it says employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, disability, marital status, or national origin currently is prohibited. Well, in the bill itself, creed, ancestry, familial status are also listed. And was that intentional, or was that just left out of the statement of intent by accident, I guess?
I think that's a good question, Senator Nelson, and I appreciate you coming to me with the question so I could find the answer for you, I think. That portion of the existing law where the sexual orientation is added, the word sexual orientation is added, is the section of statute dealing with the permitting cities, counties, and others, municipalities, I guess, generally, or subdivisions, to enact a law that prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation. That was left out of I don't have the exact answer for you as to why it was left out of the statement of intent, but I believe because the focus, and maybe Senator Chambers knows, but the focus of the bill is on employment, and which is another section of the statute. So that would be my answer to that, Senator Nelson.
Senator Ashford, I have another question.
There's Senator Nelson over there. I apologize, Senator Carlson. Thanks, Senator Erdman, for that. Appreciate it.
Okay, Senator Ashford, the other thing that's come around we've been given has your initials on it, on the Nebraska Association of Sociological Indicators survey. And I was given this yesterday, and had a nice brief visit with a young man that came to see me about this and gave this to me. And what I've gotten a little information from you that indicated this was a polling of 1,800 people statewide, but we've got results here for 49 districts. And if we divide 1,800 by 49, that's about 36 per district, which is not very many. But the other thing is, if you look down there, and you and I talked about this, District 6 through District 4 through District 13 have the same exact results. It's been a while, but I know a little bit about random sampling and how you go about it, and that's just highly, highly, highly unlikely that on a random survey you could have that kind of results exactly. And then we look down at District 25 through 29, look on the back side, District 46, they're all exactly 83%, same results. So I've got some questions about these results, and I don't have the knowledge of how this really was conducted either, and I don't know what additional information you might have.
Thank you, Senator Carlson. I always, being half Scandinavian, I always think they're kind of all alike. You know, look, I get mixed up. But
yeah.
My answer is, and it's a good question. My answer is, and I think you helped me with the
1 minute
yourself, and that is that it is a large group, 1,800, which certainly can be a representative sample of, but it's reported by district. And in that regard, there are, I believe you mentioned 36 persons per district were polled. And I've done some work in this area, and my answer would be, without studying it, that the smaller the sample per district does explain to some extent the consistency in the numbers. But I could be corrected. But that would be my answer, Senator.
Okay, thank you, Senator Ashford. And I would just make one other comment before I sit down, that I appreciated Senator Friend's ideas on this and the amendment, and I would tend to agree with him. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Carlson and Senator Ashford. Senator Chambers, you are next and recognized.
Thank you. Mr. President, members of the legislature, there was one time Jesus was being confronted, and it might have been in the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, and he asked God to let him go back and tell his brothers who were living like he had lived, don't come to this place, it's terrible. And the statement was made, they won't believe though one came back from the dead. So Senator Fulton will not change his mind. And let me show you what happens with these engineers who want to give the impression of being so logical. He mentioned the salary level of an African-American household where the people had 3 years of education, high school education. He did the same thing when he talked about the Hispanics. Then he went to homosexuals and didn't mention an education level, did he? So didn't he use a different standard for making his judgments? And when he talked about the average salary of households around the country, did he say average salaries of those with 3 years of college or high school education? No, because he's accepting this propaganda to support his homophobic view. There is not a definition for any of these other categories, but they don't say, what does sex mean? Sex to me means intercourse. It doesn't say gender. You all are putting that on it. And you know what you tell me? People know what you mean when you say sex. When the court, the Supreme Court, which rules on these kind of issues, put the term sexual orientation in its own code of conduct. Why didn't they define it? Because they know what it means, and so does Senator Fulton, and so does Senator Friend. They dummy up when it's convenient to do so. What does national origin mean? Does it apply to Senator Fulton? His origin, I presume, is in America. But there's a derivation from the Philippines. He calls himself a Filipino. Well, maybe because he's got a white father who can give him some cover, he can try to talk like a white person. But if he had a Filipino father and his name was Macapagal instead of Fulton, then he'd see something. He wants to say that there's no discrimination because he hasn't seen it. He hasn't taken any polls or statistics, and he's not following the logic that he wants to make us believe he believes in because he's an engineer. He uses that dodge when it's convenient. And sometimes he'll even say, I want the data, the data, the data. He's the one who gave the example. He thinks I don't pay attention to him. He might have forgotten that he said an African-American household with 3 years of high school education. Hispanic, 3 years of high school education. Average around the country, no mention of education level. Homosexuals, no mention of education. Then Senator Carlson is going to raise issues with this poll that Senator Ashford gave him, but he didn't even think about what Senator Fulton said because they're on the same side. And for Senator Carlson and Senator Friend, who don't read the existing law, it is thick. On page 32 of the bill, existing law. This act shall not apply to a religious corporation, organization, association, or society with respect to the employment of individuals of a particular religion to perform work connected with the carrying on by such corporation, organization, association, or society of its religious activities or the employment of any individual by his or her parent, grandparent, spouse, child, or grandchild, or in the domestic service of any person. So those ideas are already in the law. This is not a strange amendment as Senator Friend is talking about, and it used to always be in the bill every time it was introduced, and he never objected to it and said it shouldn't have been there. This is the closest he has come to skullduggery, shenaniganery, and shellgamery. And I shall pursue that further the next time I'm recognized by any manner. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Chambers. Next up is Senator Erdman, followed by Senator Harms.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would Senator Ashford yield to a question?
Senator Ashford, would you yield to a question?
Senator Ashford.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Would you help me understand why this I'm following along with what Senator Chambers just said, and I think it intends to do more than what's here, just so that we're all clear. This amendment complements what's in existing law. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
And then it extends beyond the organization, association, or society of its religious activities to also include nonprofit institutions that are operated, supervised, and controlled with, in conjunction with a religious corporation, organization, association, or society. So essentially, it's not just the organization itself, but how far in that organization does that go? Does that anything that organization that may be considered a religious entity would conduct, or is there some demarcation that?
It's broad, Senator Erdman.
So you would argue, or you would state, that it would be an outright exemption for religious organizations, regardless of number of employees?
That would be my intent, Senator Erdman.
Okay. Senator Ashford, if I can continue on, I was just joking. I know you're not Senator Johnson.
I might be.
I don't think you got that, but I think he's better looking, but I won't say that out loud.
No. Keep that to yourself, Senator Erdman, if you would.
Thank you. If I look at the sheet that you distributed on statewide employment laws and policies, and I do think that this is important, but I want to point out that what is recognized as a term may not be universally recognized. And I'm not trying to necessarily pick a battle here, but there are a number of states, 17 states, including the District of Columbia, that have similar protections as what Senator Chambers and LB 475 would propose. My research shows that 8 of them have a definition in law. In your opinion, based as your position as the chair of the judiciary, does the court have a definition, or is there a general understanding that the court applies when they put it in their canon that what this term means? I just simply want to know.
And that's a fair question, but would you please repeat the beginning of your question again?
Sure.
Because I didn't follow your...
Other states have adopted a specific definition.
For what? Sexual
For the term sexual orientation. What it is, and actually there's things that say that it does not include. Senator Chambers has appropriately displayed that there are existing statutory references as well as the courts have used this term. Do you know if there is because I know it's not in statute anywhere, do you know if the court has a standard or a terminology that they use generally to reflect what that represents?
Thank you, sir. Yes, there are myriad of cases that would utilize the term sexual orientation. I don't have the cases in front of me, and which would deal with a particular fact circumstance. But if that's what you're asking, the question is, do we need to add additional language to the bill regarding the definition of sexual orientation? My opinion is no, but if there is other language that would better define it, I would be happy to look at it.
Sure. And I'm just curious because it is a standard of the court, or at least of the judges, and I wanted to make sure that if there was a process or a term that we could use. And that's all I would have for you, Senator Ashford. Thank you for your response. One of the things that needs to be pointed out, and whether you're in favor or opposed to the bill in the form that it is in, I think there is some ambiguity. And if there wasn't, you wouldn't find definitions in other states. Senator Nankus pointed out that something that is illegal is not this definition. And in other states, such as Illinois, they specifically state that sexual orientation does not include a physical or sexual attraction to a minor by an adult. I think that was at least one of the arguments Senator Fulton made, and if that's what this is intended to say, I don't see why that's a problem to state that, if that's clearly the intent of the law, because this is a standard that the employer will have to be using to determine their employment practices, or the standard that they will be held to in the event that a circumstance would come up in which they would find themselves subject to this act, either by the transcript here on the floor or in statute. I think it should be clear at least to some parameters as to what this term generally refers to, since there is no specific definition either in state law or in the court's canon. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Erdman. Next up is Senator Harms, followed by Senator Rogert. Senator Harms, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President and colleagues. I rise to support EM 399, but I oppose LB 475. And Senator Shimmick, in her statement, caught my attention in regard to talking about sons and daughters or children, something of that nature. And I'd have to tell you, if my son or my daughter came to me and said, Dad, I want you to know that I'm gay, I would love them the same. I think life is a series of choices. Your lifestyle is whatever you choose to live. It's not my responsibility to be critical of what lifestyle you choose to live. Doesn't mean that I have to agree upon it. But my opposition to this has never been whether you're gay or not. It's the fact that we want to place this in the same category as race, color, creed, religion, ancestry, sex, marital status, and national origin. I do not believe that sexual orientation belongs there. I do not believe of what lifestyle you choose. If it was my son or daughter, as I said before, I would love them the same. It's their choice. It doesn't mean that I would agree with it, but that's your choice. And I would make sure that you're taken care of. And so, and over the years, I've had the fortunate opportunity to be on a number of commissions and things, not only in Nebraska but across the country, and I have worked with people who were gay. And I never opposed them. I didn't look at them differently because I think life's just a series of choices, and you choose what style of life you want to live. I would yield the rest of my time to Senator Fulton if he needs it.
Senator Fulton, you have 2 minutes, 45 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Harms. I'd like to respond, if I could, to Senator Chambers' scrutinization of the numbers. I'm not positive why this was the Simmons Market Research Bureau's first survey that was released in 1989. I was citing from the Wall Street Journal, July 18th, 1991. It's a little dated, but I think it still illustrates the point. I think the reason why they listed levels of education for the Hispanic and the black categories that they performed this research with is because those are individuals who would have a hard time getting a job. A member of a minority class with a limited amount of education. The numbers, 12,000 a year and 18,000 a year approximately, represent those average household incomes, individuals having a difficult time getting a job. The national average annual household income, again, was 32,000 a year. The average annual household income for those professing a homosexual orientation, again, $55,000 a year. The numbers are stubborn things. That I was making reference to levels of education indicates the difficulty one finds in getting a job without education and being in a minority class, a protected class. That doesn't seem to flesh out. Some more information from this survey. Gay.com. It's a web portal.
1 minute.
The homosexual community represents a $610 billion market. That was a study done by the Selig Center for Growth and University of Georgia. It's probably not imperative that I cite these, but I do, just so that you know I'm not making this up. 21% of homosexuals have household incomes exceeding $100,000. 17% hold master's degrees, compared with 4% of the U.S. population as a whole. These are influential people. Is there a need to provide protected class status for those who profess a homosexual orientation? Again, the numbers are stubborn things, and I don't think so. And the question remains for the floor. I hope to hear some more debate on that. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Fulton. Senator Rogert, you're next, followed by Senator Shimmick.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members of the body, by the way, I didn't wear this shirt and tie on purpose today. It was just an accident. And I've been fairly quiet this week. We've been discussing a lot of topics. But I've gotten a few emails on this one today, and I wanted to just get up and just speak just a little bit, and then I'm going to yield my time. You've probably all gotten the same form email that I've gotten about 50 or 60 times yet this morning. And I'm just going to read a little bit out of it. It says LB 475 would tie the hands of employers from whom character and sexual behavior are meaningful factors in their hiring decisions. 475 would force some religious entities to comply with the legislation in spite of their strongly held beliefs about morality and family. LB 475 would place the state's stamp of approval on behaviors that are I'm going to play Mark Christensen, forget that word. They're harmful to physical and emotional health of individuals and cultures. Well, we're taking care of that with AM 399, and regardless of how you think about LB 475, you should vote for this amendment because of that. And I guess I want to reiterate the fact that Senator Avery made earlier, that it's scientifically proven, and it's just the truth that sexual orientation is not a learned behavior. Nobody messed these guys up. Nobody trained them to be homosexuals. Nobody taught them to be that way. They were born that way. And to discriminate them in any way should be carefully looked upon, no matter how we do it. And I was asked earlier, are there any homosexuals living in my district? And my answer was, I kind of smiled and said, well, there's probably a few, and I know there are a few, but most of them would move away because it's not a very fun life in small town rural Nebraska as a homosexual, because they're shamed a little bit, they're picked on a little bit. But I think we really need to consider carefully what we do here, and we don't want to change the laws to where we create an open door for protections for classes of people, but we want to make sure that every one of God's creatures are treated fairly and equally. And maybe this bill doesn't, maybe it doesn't, but we definitely want to look at passing AM 399 on to 475. And with that, Mr. President, I'll yield my time to Senator Chambers.
Senator Chambers, you have 2 minutes, 24 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Rogert. Members of the legislature, one reason I don't use statistics is because I base what I do on my view, on what I believe, what my principles are. Nobody will rail against white racism and white supremacy more than me, but you cannot find a white person who ever approached me for help whom I did not help. And they're the ones who, as a group, are oppressing black people as a group. Yet here's Senator Fulton, a member of a group who would be discriminated against if he wasn't protected by a white father who could protect him while he was little, send him to school, take care of him, and if anybody said anything, they knew he had a white daddy at home. Yeah, this is reality. He's been shielded all of his life. He says he's a Filipino, but he's not. Why would not a Filipino come to him for anything? You just heard the reason. He'd say, well, you're Filipino. You say you're discriminated against. I'm not. And by the way, I didn't say macaca as that racist down south said with reference to that Indian person. I said macapagal. And Senator Fulton knows that that is a Filipino name. And it's not an insult.
1 minute.
This is a racist society. It has a lot of homophobes in this society. Senator Fulton ignored what I said, although he knows it's true, that there are prominent preachers like Jerry Falwell. He's gone to wherever people like him go. And Pat Robertson, who blamed tornadoes and attacks on the Twin Towers on homosexuals. And Senator Fulton doesn't see anything wrong with that. Well, that doesn't indicate they have a problem in this society just because somebody says God punishes the country because of them. Senator Rogert mentioned what Senator Fulton has to know because he reads a lot. In small towns, what would happen to a person who would acknowledge he is a homosexual man or a woman that she's a lesbian woman? I'm so much better off than all these hypocritical Christians who talk about loving everybody. I don't even have to love everybody. But I show more of it than they do because I don't have religion impeding me and hiding behind it. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Chambers. Senator Shimmick, you are next, followed by Senator Nankus.
Mr. President, I will yield my time to Senator Chambers.
Senator Chambers, you have 4 minutes and 52 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. President. Bless you, Senator Shimmick. Members of the legislature, we keep hearing these hypocrites stand up here and talk about we're creating a class and giving them special rights. What we're doing is acknowledging that there are a group of people who've been singled out for mistreatment, and we are giving protection to those people from the wrongs they're suffering. This is America. When we recognize that a group of people are suffering wrongs because of what they are, we as lawmakers should provide a protection instead of hypocritically standing up here and saying, well, if my child told me that he's gay or my daughter, then I'd love him the same way and I'd help him, but he would not help them by passing a law that says they cannot be discriminated against. He's got enough money to pay for his kids when they can't get a job. But there are other people who want their children to be able to work, who want their children to not be shamed. Why do you think there are a lot of people who won't acknowledge their homosexual orientation? Because they know how people like some on this floor feel toward them. That's what they know. You all know it too. It reminds me of something I say when we discuss this bill. There was a man named Merrick, known as the Elephant Man, and he had these growths that would even push the bones out of shape, and his face was misshapen, the back, and he wore a hood, a burlap hood with an eye hole cut in it. And he was in this station or someplace. It's been a long time since I saw the film. And these boys, for some reason, started chasing him, as kids will do, just like people on this floor will do. They'll attack those and chase those who are different, instead of spreading their arms and saying, God told me to protect the least of his, and you're one of the least and need it more, so I'm going to protect you. No, they throw the stones, and they certainly are not without sin. So as he was running down the street being pursued, he bumped this little girl, she fell. Then the mob, all the Christians, in full-throated roar, chased him. And he went into a dead end, and he's backed against this wall, and there are two walls on each side, and the mob is coming to him. And somebody snatched off the hood, and the horror that he was accustomed to seeing, he saw in every one of their faces. And there were so many people there, and they were full of so much hatred that he knew he couldn't fight them off, so he made the only appeal that he could. And some were advancing on him. And he said, it was hard to understand, but you could. I am a human being. I am a human being. And they stopped. We're talking about human beings, but you all are not. You can sit here and pontificate and say, put the amendment that protects the Catholic Church. Yeah, put that on, but then you're against the bill. You wouldn't love your child if your child said that. You know your child's not going to say it, and that's why you say this. Everybody's child is my child. And I show what I would do for mine, but by what I'll do for others. If your child were of this persuasion based on the things they hear you say, they wouldn't tell you. And the boy and the girl would say, boy, I wish we could tell Dad, I wish we could tell Mama, but we know what they think about us because we hear what they say about these others who are just like us. They birthed us into the world. We didn't choose to be in a set of circumstances where people treat us like we're animals.
1 minute.
We had some Christians who came before our committee and equated people who are of the homosexual persuasion with those who practice bestiality. That's the low-down, dirty-mindedness of these people who are homophobic. They're not even talking about human beings. And those are the shameful things they say about God's children. Of one blood, Senator Carlson, God made all nations of people. And homosexuals are people too. Marriage is a chosen position. You were not born married. You chose to get married, but you're protected. So is Senator Harms, but he thinks these people should not have the protection he has as a married man and that his wife has as a married woman. Senator Carlson doesn't think they should have the protection that he has as a Christian. Same with Senator Fulton. Oh, they got their protection and they're happy. You know what America means to them? Justice, freedom, and equality for them. Did you say time?
Time, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Chambers. Senator Nankus, you are next. You are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, colleagues. Just a few comments that I wanted to address in the course of this debate. A few things brought up by my good friend, Senator Fulton, who is a careful and diligent researcher and advocate for statistics and facts. Senator Fulton, I really, number one, don't see the relevance in an average national household income survey from, I believe it was the 90s that was quoted. First of all, that doesn't really take into account the fact that, as has been noted by some other colleagues here today, there are many states that do have protections in the workplace for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered individuals. So I'd like to make that point for the record. Secondarily, I'd like to note that if in fact that is the reasons for your opposition to the amendment and the underlying bill, because you do not believe that there is rampant discrimination within society in reference to sexual orientation, then what would it bother you if we passed this law to provide some legal protection for maybe the few instances wherein this is the basis of discriminatory behavior? I wanted to just point out a couple things in that regard, and then finally just to talk and share with you what I've visited about with many of my friends and colleagues and neighbors in regards to this issue. It's difficult for me as a young person and as a student of history to look back at the pre-civil rights era and to fully understand the level of segregation and discrimination our country perpetrated amongst, upon racial minorities and women. It's very hard for me to understand that. And I truly believe the same underlying issues in regards to legal rights and protections for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered individuals and families will apply in future generations. They will look back upon our debate and dialogue today and have difficulty comprehending the opposition. With that, I would yield any remaining time to Senator Chambers. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Chambers, you have 2 minutes, 10 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Nankus. And here's something that I want to emphasize for those who keep asking about a definition. There have been many hate crimes prosecutions throughout this country, and hate crimes laws include a prohibition against committing a crime against somebody based on sexual orientation, and not one of those laws was ever challenged because there was no definition of sexual orientation. The law we have right now in the books that talks about hate crimes has no definition. You know why I don't go into that? If the definition were there that they wanted, they wouldn't support the bill anyway. They wouldn't support it anyway. And Senator Harms shocks me at his naivete. He said he didn't think that the forefathers believed in, I guess, protecting the rights of gay and lesbian people, because that's why he invoked them, but they believed in having sex with teenage girls, which would be statutory rape today, and in some cases was outright rape, sex by force. Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, George Washington.
1 minute.
And you know how you can tell that they were committing statutory rape? Because they kept records of the children they had on these slave women, and when you calculated the age of the slave as opposed to the age of the mother, that woman was in her very early teens at the time that white racist dog impregnated her, and she was his slave. And Senator Harms is going to invoke a man like that as the moral paradigm and say because men like that, he thinks, but he doesn't know, would be against what we're talking about. But he doesn't condemn them for statutory and outright rape of young girls, and their own records prove it. You got to be careful who you summon from the nether regions as your witness. I say again, I'm lucky because I can do what I think is necessary to protect anybody who is a member of any group when they are mistreated. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Chambers. Senator Fulton, you are next. This is your third time, and you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Nankus raises legitimate questions, and I'd like to respond to them. In 1991, I don't know how many laws existed providing protected class status for those professing a homosexual orientation. That being the case, there were no laws at that time. Still, homosexual households had incomes significantly higher than the national average. Now, this bill has to do with employment law, such that employers should not discriminate against individuals who profess who profess some sexual orientation. One cannot discriminate based on sexual orientation if we pass LB 475. The reason it's significant to bring up household income numbers, how does one earn an income if one is having a hard time finding a job? If a homosexual who professes that orientation is being discriminated against such that he or she cannot get a job, how is it that the homosexual, a homosexual household has that high an income? They must be able to get jobs. If one is able to get a job to that degree more than other Americans are able to earn, then I say the need for this bill doesn't exist. Now, it's rightly questioned, if there is no need, why would you be opposed to the bill? I respond by saying I'm opposed to the bill because this is a significant step. We're elevating sexual orientation to protected class status without giving it a definition. Senator Chambers, I believe, would say that a definition isn't needed. He brought up the case of bestiality. States have laws against that. Why? Consenting adult. Why is that? If we pass LB 475, I would think that individuals who I obviously disagree with in their lifestyle, but if they choose sexuality as a form of sexual expression, they would be able to say the orientation should not allow you to discriminate against that practice. Maybe that's not the case, and maybe if we know the definition of sexual orientation, that wouldn't be a concern. Maybe there are those who believe that shouldn't be a concern. I believe it should be. But that's why, if I'm trying to demonstrate that there is no need, and I believe that the numbers I put forward would indicate that there is a need, because individuals who possess a certain sexual orientation are not being discriminated against, then certainly we can recognize that just because it doesn't matter, we shouldn't elevate, because it introduces a whole area of question. Sexual orientation can mean a great deal, and in this society, which I would argue heavily saturated with sex, everything under the goes. If there is no definition, sexual orientation can mean any plethora of things. Now, Senator Chambers brought up Jerry Falwell and others who blame natural disasters on homosexuals. I'm assuming he wants me to condemn Jerry Falwell and the others for saying this. Well, I do. Natural disasters happen. It's good, bad, and everything in between. That has nothing to do with discrimination in the workplace. Respectfully, within debate, I would say that's obfuscating the point. Is there a need? And if there's a need, shall we not define who it is that is in need? Something else that I've recognized. Whether my dad is white, green, or black does not say that I've had his protection my entire life. If I did or didn't, it's irrelevant to whether this bill is worthwhile. And I will stand by the numbers and the reason and the logic as to why this bill should or shouldn't be put forward. I maintain that LB 475 is bad policy. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Fulton. Senator Chambers, you are next, and this is your third time.
Thank you. Mr. President, I'd like to ask Senator Fulton a question.
Senator Fulton, would you yield to a question?
Yes.
Senator Fulton, what population group are those figures you read us about the average income of homosexual families? What is the population group you're using?
Population group, you mean demographic?
Yes. First of all, what group are we talking about?
The group that's, well, what I'm reading from is a report that was released by the Wall Street Journal.
And was that for homosexuals in New York, in California, or just where? Because you're the man of numbers. Now, I'm going to hold you to that standard you pretend you hold yourself to. Where did the people live who were the subject of that study which resulted in those numbers?
My understanding that it was a countrywide study.
Oh, then let's bring, is this a law that's going to affect the country as a whole?
No, this law would affect the state of Nebraska.
Okay, so let's bring it to Nebraska, Mr. Engineer, who believes in the numbers and wants to stick with the numbers. How many homosexual households are there in Nebraska?
I do not know.
What is the average income of a homosexual household in Nebraska?
I do not know, but I don't think it'd be unreasonable to say that it's higher than the average.
How do you, if you don't know, how can you say that, Mr. Engineer? If you don't know, how can you say what it is if you don't know what it is?
I would say that I do know based on what the national averages are.
Oh, so you know what the average in Nebraska is based on what the national average is?
I believe that it would be higher than what the average in Nebraska is.
Thank you, Mr. Fulton. This is the man who wants to make you think. He has done so much research, and you see how he answers that question. He should have stopped when he said, I don't know. He brought us a flawed paradigm, and we're supposed to be dumb enough to accept it because he's dumb enough to bring it. And I know he's been protected by his father, and he knows that I know it. He can fool you all, and he can say it's not relevant. But you know why it's relevant? Because I'm talking about his attitude. He's been shielded and protected, and that's why he believes there's no discrimination. And as for Falwell and the rest of them, I mentioned them, Mr. Engineer, to show you the attitude of people in this society toward homosexuals. You didn't listen carefully, so you didn't understand what I was saying. You're so busy being defensive that you had to come up with an answer, and you hurt yourself. Let's say there is a family of homosexuals in Nebraska, and their average income is $10,000. There's another family with an average, and their income is $100,000. The two family incomes together constitute $110,000, so the average family income of homosexuals in Nebraska is $55,000. That is so inane. Talk about obfuscation. Obfuscation would be elevating his argument to a level to which it is not entitled. He knows better than to bring that kind of mess to me. He tells other people that he associates with that he's an engineer and he researches, and that causes them to be taken with fear and trembling. You brought it, Senator Fulton, and you're going to try to use a national study, and you don't even know how many people from each state were involved. You don't even know if each state was involved. And then he's going to apply it to Nebraska. He doesn't know how many homosexual families there are in Nebraska. And what difference would that make anyway as far as the justice of what it is that we're doing? If every one of them made $100,000, they should not be discriminated against. There are black people who make large amounts of money, and they cannot buy houses in Omaha where their money would entitle them to buy if there was not racial discrimination. That's why I know that he's been protected. He doesn't even understand the kind of discrimination that people confront when they are a member of a minority. There are two minority members in this body, Chambers and Aguilar. When we talk about black people, It's not hue, it's point of view. He needs to understand some things. He's the one who said he's a minority member, not me. As for this bestiality, if a human being did that, that would be considered abuse of the animal, Senator Fulton. You cannot cut off an animal's head because you want to. That is a felony.
Time.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Chambers. Senator Ashford, you are next, and you are recognized.
Yeah, I'm coming. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to say a few things, and then Senator Carlson has indicated that he has some information on his poll, my poll, and I want to give him some time. And I know this is a passionate issue. I worked very hard when I was in the legislature before on the hate crimes law, as I mentioned before. I do believe that there is discrimination, and there has been discrimination historically against people who, based on their sexual orientation. I grew up in an industry where there was a tremendous amount of discrimination, and I knew many people who suffered that discrimination. And it's not important for me to talk about that in detail. I mean, we've read about what's happened over the centuries where people are discriminated against for sexual orientation. I don't think, and in listening to my colleagues, I don't think anybody in this room does not believe that there is discrimination of some kind. And they support, and I appreciated Senator Engel's comments about hate crimes because he supports that, and I think that's significant. I think it's a real problem. I have many gay friends, and I know it's a problem. And I know there's a debate about whether homosexuality is a choice or whether it's something you inherit. I quite frankly don't particularly care whether it's a choice or whether it's something you inherit. I know that people who are gay are gay in their whole being. And I have had experience with many people, as I've said, and over my lifetime, who are gay, and I feel deeply sorry for the way they are treated, and they are treated in a discriminatory fashion. And I support this bill and voted it out of committee, not because I expected this kind of debate. We had the same kind of debate over hate crimes, over whether or not we should put into statute the words sexual orientation. Senator Erdman is correct. There are numbers of states that define it differently. But in my heart, I know that there is discrimination. It happens on a daily basis. And I also know that for the most part, people who are gay, who have a sexual orientation that's different from the majority, have that sexual orientation for reasons that they can't even explain, but they have it. And in the committee, we attempted, and maybe it's not, and apparently not good enough, to address the sincere concerns of religious institutions about applying a law like this to those institutions. I just would summarize and say this. I know that Senator Fulton, Senator Engel, Senator Carlson are not interested in discriminating against anybody. I think we just all have differences of opinion as to how pervasive this problem is, or the nature of the problem. Nobody here today is going to change anybody's mind about that. I think our minds are already made up. But for me, these kinds of things are important, and that doesn't mean that they're not important to my colleagues. I just think we have to continue to be in our society. We have to continue to be observant. We have to continue to be watchful of discrimination, because we all know the history. We all know what happened in World War II. We all know about those things. And I know my colleagues don't want that to happen again, and they're not advocating that. But it could happen again. There's no question in my mind it could happen again. And my colleagues aren't going to be people who are going to be part of that if it ever happens again. But I think it could happen again. I believe that in my marrow. I believe it absolutely, sincerely, without any equivocation. And as long as we deal with the issue of religious beliefs and the institutions where religious beliefs may not have that same sort of feeling about the issue, which is a concern to me, and I'm glad the amendment's in there. If that's not enough for some of my colleagues, I respect that. But I'm going to be voting for this amendment. I'm going to be voting for the bill because we can never lose sight of what the past has taught us. And it is truly important to me. Thank you.
Sorry I missed your warning, Senator. Thank you, Senator Ashford. Senator Carlson, you are next. You are recognized.
Mr. President, members of the legislature, I simply wanted to rise because I questioned this survey that Senator Ashford handed out, and Nanette in my office tracked down and got some information back, and so I don't want to hide it. I want to just cover it a bit. These questions were asked in 2004 by the Bureau of Sociological Research at the University of Nebraska, and indicates it's a survey, a random sample telephone survey of approximately 1,800 adults in Nebraska. Now, I don't know how the question was asked, the tone or anything like that, and I'm not, when it says random sample, I will accept that it was a random sample. The first question, is it okay for an employer to hire or not hire an applicant based on the applicant's sexual orientation? And the additional information I have lumps everything together. And so the categories that could have been selected were strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree. And to that first question, the combined percentages were about 72% that either disagreed or strongly disagreed. And then the second question, a property owner should be allowed to rent or sell a property based on potential renter or buyer's sexual orientation. And the same 5 categories were possibilities, and to those, about 67% disagreed or strongly disagreed. So I had this information, wasn't going to ignore it, and that's what I wanted to announce. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Carlson. Senator Shimmick, you are next, followed by Senator Nankus. Senator Shimmick, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President, members, and thank you, Senator Carlson. I think 1,800 is a very large sampling. Usually, they consider that you need about 300, I believe, per congressional district, and that's a very good-sized sample. So I think that the Bureau of Sociological Research also is an independent group that you would not expect to have a slanted kind of poll. You know, I guess that those of us who have faced discrimination at some point in our life may be sensitive to the discrimination that others may be exposed to. I can tell you that I have been. I don't talk about it. I don't think it's something that I want to dwell on, but I can remember when I was young and newly married, had a new baby, and wanted to get back into teaching, and my husband had already been hired and was teaching in a public high school in this state, and I applied, and I have to tell you that my resume was as good or better than his, and I'm not saying that for any reason than just to explain that my resume wasn't even looked at, even though they needed a history teacher, and the explanation was that they wouldn't hire me because I was married to somebody who was already working in the system. And I felt very discriminated against on that basis. I felt that I had just as much right to apply for a job in that public school as he did, and he felt the same way, too. I have to tell you that. And if I had known then what I know now, I might have taken him to court over it, because there was no good reason. I mean, What were they worried about, that we were going to fight in the hallways, or we were going to be caught necking in one of the classrooms? I don't know. But there was absolutely no earthly reason except that my marital status. And maybe that's not even so egregious as the old policies that school systems had of not hiring married women at all. If you were a married woman, you were not hired by the school system. And later on, if you were a pregnant woman married, you certainly couldn't work for that school system. And the minute you got pregnant, you had to leave that school system. Now, some of you are young and may not remember those days, but I remember, and that's not been so long ago. If you've never experienced it, you may not feel it for somebody else as powerfully as some who have been discriminated against. Mr. President, how much time do I have?
1 minute 43.
Then I will just say that I hope we can keep this debate on a level on which we try to share pertinent information with others. I agree with Senator Ashford. Probably minds are already made up on this issue. But it probably is important to say things for the record. Senator Nankus alluded to this a little while ago, but we had a conversation, several of us did a little while back, and the consensus was that eventually, 8 years down the road or 10 years down the road, this issue will be a thing of the past.
1 minute.
And people won't even believe that we ever had to have this discussion on the floor of the legislature time and time again. It will be something that is just accepted. And I think that by looking at that map that Senator Ashford passed out to this group, I think that you can see that states are gradually filling in. We will have 2 on our borders shortly that have passed such laws. And I suspect that in another 10 years, this map will probably be about full. I don't want to see Nebraska be a big hole in the center of the universe. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Shimmick. Madam Clerk?
Mr. President, Senator Chambers would move to amend AM 399 with Floor Amendment 116.
Senator Chambers, you are recognized open on your floor amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is for the purpose of giving me the opportunity to continue speaking, but in line 2 of the floor of the amendment that is offered by the Judiciary Committee, I would strike the 3 words, the employment non-discrimination, and replace those words with the word this. So instead of saying provisions of the non-discrimination, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, it would simply say provisions of this act. It's not a substantive change. I will withdraw it, but it's to give me the opportunity. I want to read a letter that just came today, part of it. Dear Senator Chambers, and this is from a white guy. I'd even forgotten about him. Back in 1989, you were kind enough to write a reference letter from me to the Texas Board of Law Examiners recommending my approval to sit for the bar examination, notwithstanding my felony record in the state of Nebraska. Due in part to your recommendation, the Texas Board of Law Examiners determined that I possessed, quote, good moral character, unquote, and approved my application. Although I eventually took the California bar instead, passing on my first attempt in February 1993, I submitted your letter to the California bar, which also approved my application. Then he mentions how long he's practiced in California and so forth. Now, y'all have heard me, as I stated, rail against white racism. But I bet I got more letters like this from white people that I've helped, whom some of you all would not even deign to help. And I've helped a lot of those people in Nebraska when they're mistreated by the police and the sheriffs and the state patrol and school systems. I'm working on a case now where a little boy, I'm not sure whether he had autism, was drinking out of a toilet stool in a school. See, y'all don't believe that, do you? But it's brought to me. The family went everywhere they could, got no help, and they finally had to come to me. And I'm going to see what we can do about that. There are many people in this society who are mistreated. But I'd like to ask Senator Fulton a question or two to give him an opportunity to rehabilitate himself after that scathing critique I made. Senator Fulton, you were talking about the need for definitions. In your opinion, is that correct?
I was, yes.
Is race one of the items which a person cannot be discriminated against based upon?
Yes.
Is race a scientific term?
It could be. I don't know that it is specifically.
Is race deemed by scientists to be a scientific term?
It could be. Anthropologists would say yes.
Race, thank you. Members of the legislature, that's all I'll ask you, Senator Fulton. Race has no scientific meaning. It is not recognized as a scientific term. It is utilized for convenience sake, especially in a country like America. Some people talk about a white race. What is a white race? There was a judge who talked about a Hispanic race. Some of these terms relate to culture, not even biological makeup, not even necessarily originating in a country where that designation would apply. Language is used very, very carefully, carelessly, and loosely. But that's a word that's not defined in the current law, and nobody worries about that, and courts haven't had any difficulty applying the word. Does marital status refer to somebody who is single as well as somebody who's married, somebody who's divorced, somebody who was married and got an annulment? That term is not defined. None of these words are defined. What is religion? Religion is not defined anywhere in the statute. They're not worried about that because it applies to them. All he got to do is say, I belong to the Catholic faith. I'm a religious person. I'm discriminated against because of my religion. He doesn't have to define it any further. Age. What does age mean? Some people say it's not so much a matter of years as of responsibility. But there's a general, conventional acceptance of what the term age applies to. Could it apply to a certain period in history? The age of iron, the age of brass, the age of stone tools, the ice age? Or does it refer to the number of years a person has been on this earth? They don't define these terms, and they don't have to be defined, and courts have used these terms and applied them, and the court is where you have to be concerned about their application and whether or not they're understood. If the Nebraska Supreme Court thought people didn't know what the term sexual orientation meant, and the court is imposing the duty not to discriminate on that basis on judges, lawyers, and others who come into the courtroom, the court would have defined the term, but the court knows what it means, and Senator Fulton knows what it means. But back to bestiality. If he had sex with an animal, that would be considered animal abuse. I don't care what his orientation is. He could say his religion tells him that he's got to take a cat and gut it alive. But that would be a felony in Nebraska, and he can call it religion all he wants to. He could say that his religion requires him to have sex with his daughter, and he'd go to jail for it, regardless of what he said his orientation was. So these people who are so intelligent suddenly dummy up and don't understand anything. They know, but they're taking an unsupportable position, and they got to find a way to make it sound plausible. He can't escape. He's done a lot of damage to his credibility today as an engineer. Oh, wait a minute, I made a presumption. What kind of engineer is Senator Fulton? He never told us. Maybe he's the kind of engineer who put his hat on backward, grabbed that throttle, and pulled that string. Whoo, whoo. Whoo, whoo. Isn't that an engineer? I made a presumption. Why should I expect somebody who spent his life driving trains to understand the intricacies of logic? or to understand that a study that is from 1991 based on a population group that we're not discussing would apply in 2007 today in Nebraska. Well, to somebody who's been driving trains, that's allowable. So I'll pass on from that. People will talk about my passion towards something. If that means that I feel deeply what I'm dealing with, then I will accept the term, but I never apply it to anything that I do. I'm not passionate toward things. I might be passionate toward a person, but not a thing or an idea. I think language should be more carefully used than that. But I feel deeply about what I'm talking about here. And we're not going to get a vote on it today. Our numbers were few from the beginning, so don't worry about that. To disabuse you of that misperception. I'm going to go back to what I was talking about on religion because somebody prayed this morning. Senator Fulton, somebody was talking about whether or not I'd ever offer a prayer. And if I did, what would the result be? And the person said, well, God wouldn't pay attention to it. And when the person was asked, why wouldn't he? You know what the reply was? God would think he was joking. See there? If I wanted to pray, of what value would it be? None. So why should I bother with that? You gave me a statement that said the best sermons are lived, not preached. The best way to show that religion has impact is to apply it. Why call ye me Lord, Lord, and do not the things that I say? Many people will say, Lord, Lord, on that day, and I'll say, depart from me, because I know you not. Why do you say you don't know me? Because I was hungry, naked, and so forth, and you turned your back on me.
1 minute.
And you did it to the least of these, you did it unto me. The ones who deserved help and protection, you refused to give it to them, you refused to give it to me. I doubt if there's a person on this floor who professes to be a Christian, if they saw what they really believed to be Jesus walking through here and he said, I need a drink of water, 48 cups of water would appear. I need a hamburger. They'd zoom in their cars to Burger King or McDonald's and come back with 48 hamburgers. But then find somebody who is ragged, emaciated, maybe with body odor, matted hair, dirty, and say, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty. They say, security, red coat, get this person out of here, because there's no room in this inn. Now, we have people who are knocking at the door, and we have Senator Fulton talking about numbers. Numbers. 15 years old. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Chambers. Senator Erdman, you're next and you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Senator Friend. Senator Chambers, would you yield to a question?
Senator Chambers, would you yield to a question?
Yes, I will.
Senator, it'll actually be more than one question, but we have had conversations in the past about the construction of law and how in different circumstances the court may interpret or construct a remedy or a may extend the plain reading of a language, whether it's constitutional or otherwise, and generally under equal protection, they extended a different provision of the law to accomplish equal protection in Nebraska. You recall, we even had that conversation today?
Yes, but let us say they interpret the law to say that it applies to that situation.
Fair enough, fair enough. When we're constructing language, and we had a very good tutorial on LB 142, which was criminal statute, about the words must mean something. And
yes.
In a criminal law, when you're, as Senator Pershey is or was, a prosecutor, maybe he still is, you have a burden to prove the individual has violated the act or the crime in which we have committed in statute, and those words mean something towards proving that guilt.
Yes, you have to prove every element of the offense beyond a reasonable doubt. Correct.
Fair enough. When you go to the civil law, which is what this law is, you still have a burden of understanding what the law is, but it may not be as high in the terms of strict understanding of that terminology. Is that a fair representation of criminal law versus civil law?
Civil law requires a preponderance of the evidence, which means if you have a scale, whichever one can tilt the scale the least bit is the one who wins.
And which side of the scale did Mr. Hergert end up in?
Mr. Hergert wound up where he belonged. The scales of justice.
But that was the same standard that we use now under impeachment proceedings, was the preponderance of evidence.
Yes.
As opposed to beyond reasonable doubt.
Yes.
Okay. We spent a great deal of time on LB 564 this session dealing with recreational liability. That's a civil law, correct?
Yes.
And I believe I have written somewhere that words mean something, and you spent a great deal of time going through the language of that law, but it was because we wanted to make sure, at least you did, that people understood what was in the Act.
Yes.
As it pertained to either those that would be subject to the Act or the potential remedy that would be removed from those individuals that would seek it under the current interpretation of the Court, which has now changed with the passage of 564. Is that accurate?
Correct. Just as everybody on this floor knows that this bill is dealing with homosexuality.
Fair enough. And that would be my next question. If you go back 10 years ago, and I don't know exactly when Senator Ashford his previous term was, some of the issues he was talking about when sexual orientation was proposed, that was the plain meaning of the word, which is generally what the courts would construct as their interpretation of the law, absent a definition. Is that accurate? And then they have other vehicles, if it's not clear to them what that means, that they can go and decipher that. Is that
Are you asking me, am I of the opinion that when the hate crimes law was adopted in the first instance, the courts understood what sexual orientation meant? Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And would you say that that same definition is the same definition that could be extended to the canons and the provisions that they have in their court rulings or court directions for judges that you've referenced here today, and would be the same understanding that would be advanced should this bill become law?
I'm saying that the court knows what that term means and would apply that meaning to any case that came before it where sexual orientation was at issue.
And if I heard you correctly, you said that you believe it's clear that everyone knows that that term means homosexuality for the purposes of this bill or that term in statute. Is that?
I'm saying we all know that's what we're talking about.
Okay. So absent legislative history or something specific that says what that terminology would mean, absent that, in the plain reading of the language, then the court would have another vehicle in which they would have to analyze what the intent was to determine what that definition would be, correct?
If the court has already dealt with this subject, as courts have, and they will look to other jurisdictions,
right,
they will not be swayed by what we say on the floor of the legislature that something means, but if we write a definition in statute, then that definition will control and govern.
Okay. Fair enough. And I think that's appropriate. I mean, I'm understanding what you're saying. The term race, religion, gender, those things have been tried in the courts and are either generally accepted based on the plain reading of their language, or there's precedent that determines that.
They'll say the general understanding.
Right. Thank you.